Well, welcome friends and family to yet another blog. I believe this is blog 9, dated 24th of April 2022. So we're heavily going really fast now, and you'd think I'd be getting a little bit used to this now, but no, I'm still a nervous Nelly, and just moving forward as best as I can. Now, we know the format by now, and I start off with the news. But it was interesting that I started off with the news last week and it caused quite a few comments. Just want to let you know that I do the news to just a date stamp. I really don't do much in regards to politics or anything like that. It was interesting to see people's views, and it was nice that they actually do match my own. But keep all of that in hand, because really it's just a date stamp, what I do here, so that when I look back, I know I've got a prompt in my head that was going on in the week. So last week was Easter weekend, so of course I wanted to remind myself what went on in that week leading up to Easter. So let's carry on. The war, as we know, is not ended. President Zelensky says that the Ukraine is only the start of this war and other countries are next. But who? Question mark. I read this article and I was sort of expecting it, because what's happening to Ukraine is absolutely terrible. And what we have to think about here is, as Russia encroaches upon more of Ukraine land, you have to ask yourself, are they going to stretch further? Because then they'll be on the border of so many other countries, Poland, etc. So are we looking at another world war? Now, for God's sake, I hope that doesn't happen. I've never been, in my life there has not been a world war. My father was around for World War II. He talked a little bit about World War II. Of course, it was in study groups for history at school. We've all seen documentaries on it. For God's sake, let's not have another world war. Just to continue on that, there was an interesting article about shopping. So Tesco has rationed sunflower oil to 3 units per customer due to a shortage, and the shortage is due to the war. Waitrose and Morrison's have now followed suit, and they've reduced theirs to 2 starting today. What with everything that's going on with COVID and lockdowns and wars and everything else, the cost of living, this is just the start, and you can see it's just the start, and I just don't know what we're going to do. Now, sunflower oil is obviously something that a lot of people use. I don't use it much in my cooking. I don't have time other than ready meals and doing the odd beans on toast and etc. But we use it a lot. I mean, sometimes I'll have some popcorn. That will be done with oil. So what's next? We've just gone through Easter. I think everybody noticed that the eggs were smaller this year, like they are every year. So with cocoa and everything going up in price, it's just going to get worse. Now, just a date stamp today, there's an article about insults. The French presidential campaign has turned into an insult farce ahead of Sunday's election. So just to date stamp this, there is a French election going on. Everybody goes to the polls today. They're going to have a new president. So we'll see what happens with that. And then the good news about COVID is that COVID cases dropped 15% last week, which has been a surprise to many, being as that was during holiday week for Easter. So, hey, I'll take any good news that's going, because there's very little of it. So what I usually do next is just say what's going on with me and a little bit, but there's nothing going on at work at the moment. I have, it was a very short week. The appeal process will probably take several more weeks before I hear back. You never know, I might hear something this week, I don't know. So other than what I've been doing, which is pretty much, I played a couple of games. I did play Pikmin 3. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I didn't get round to Red Dead Redemption. And what I watched on TV was the Muhammad Ali documentary, which I'm thoroughly enjoying. I think that ends this week or next. And I've been watching stuff on YouTube. Just want to say a few things about watching things on YouTube. I think we all have a little bit of a routine. My routine spans a little bit around you guys. So there was a lovely YouTube stream from Bill Hurd. Now, Bill Hurd was an engineer at Commodore, and I've actually got a signature of his for when I went to a Commodore show at the Novotel Hotel back in the 80s. He wanted to wish the Commodore 64 happy birthday. He started to run through everything that Commodore did and all the projects he worked on. He's a very interesting guy. I recommend that you Google that one, Happy Birthday C64 by Bill Hurd. Then I watched what I normally do. So I watched Mainmeister's Waffle. He also did a little watch with Mainmeister on a TV show called Starcade, which is a game show based around arcade machines, which I'd seen before, but it's always fun to watch with people. Rabbit helped me reminisce about Choplifter yesterday. Choplifter to me was a game that I saw on the Apple IIe at school, so that was interesting. And it reminded me that sometimes there are games that are designed on home computers that then turn into arcade machines. And that's particularly one of them, because Sega bought that. It's a classic game. Look up Choplifter. And I watched a little self-documentary TV movie called Bud and Lou. That's based on Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. And that's because I finished all my monster movies and Laurel and Hardy movies for the most part. And I then started to move into the next era, the 40s to the 50s. And Bud Abbott and Lou Costello were some of the top comedians in film around that time. I had a little bit of a discussion with some of my friends on Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, and they are remembered. Not quite so fondly, I think, as Laurel and Hardy. But there was one friend that I thought deserved a box set. So, although I haven't got an awful lot of cash, I do like to treat some friends that, that I think deserve it. This person has been calling me and having little discussions for weeks and weeks and weeks. So I bought a box set for him, so hope that arrived, and hope he enjoyed it. So who's been watching my channel and leaving me some comments? Well, they are Martroid, Robert Morrison, Down the Rabbit Hole, Highlander, Panther, 8-Bit Steve, Colin Jones, Ian Batchelor, Jambon. And most of those I gave a shout out to and answered their questions in the comment section of the blog. And Milfy Swimbuckle asked a question, and he wanted it answered in the blog. And he wanted to know, were there any films that have never been made that I'd have liked to have seen got made? And that, again, these are all questions that have to make me think, because when you think about the history of cinema and what films have been out, what books have been turned into films, what TV shows have been turned into films, and vice versa, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. But I did think about it a little bit, and I'm not big into sequels. But I thought of a couple that I thought I'd have liked to have seen a continuation on. I've shown you the soundtrack last week to 2001: A Space Oddity, and that has a sequel that was called 2010: The Year We Made Contact. But then it stopped. There was no more. Now, it was a Arthur C. Clarke set of books. There's a couple more books after that. The second film, 2010, was never called the Year We Made Contact. It was based on a book called Odyssey 2, and the third book was called Odyssey 3. Unimaginative a little bit. I think that would have been interesting to have that film made, because even though the second film has a different feel to it, I would have liked to have seen that continued. I'd have liked to have seen a TV series called The Outer Limits made into a film, because I enjoyed the Twilight Zone film that was made. Twilight film didn't do very well, had a fantastic music score. The stories were just redone from the TV series into an anthology type film, where you cut different stories together into one, and it was encompassed by one story that had a start and an end, based on a hitchhiker, which I think had Dan Aykroyd, if I remember rightly. So The Outer Limits might be a bit of a harder ask to make an anthology film of that, because the episodes were also an hour long compared to a half-hour segment, so cutting them down was difficult. But we mustn't lose track that The Outer Limits was a show that had a very high pop culture. There's a lot of films that came out of the TV series The Outer Limits. Terminator came out of The Outer Limits. I think Blade Runner did. I'm not sure on that. But there was a lot of interesting stories about what would be the next evolution of man. What if we were invaded by a species much smaller than us? All sorts of lovely Twilighty Zone stuff, but it didn't really have the shock ending. It was more the monster of the week. And if I wanted a sequel, I think I'd like to see Beetlejuice. Now, I believe that that's been discussed a lot in Hollywood. Let's make a Beetlejuice 2. I don't think it'll ever happen. Tim Burton would have done it by now. Michael Keaton is still around, so there's a chance that it will, as is Gina Davis. So those would be the three films that I'd like to see get made. So what do we do after this? What arrived this week? Let's get that out the way. So nothing special here. I'm broke, so most of the stuff is pre-order. This was a late arrival. This is my alternate cover to the new Spider-Man film. It's another steel book. All it is a different cover. You can see it's from a different country. There will be a special edition that will come out, but Spider-Man's my sort of like fan character, so when that film comes out I tend to be a bit extravagant with what I buy. And then a 4K version of Watchmen came out, which is the ultimate cut. Wasn't really a big fan of DC or the Vertigo line, and Watchmen was an interesting film because it's a different take on superheroes. These ones were retired, lost favour, and there's a lot of interesting angles with what that will do to a person that's then retired. What do they do? Where do they go? And of course leading up to what they consider to be 12 o'clock, which is Armageddon. So Watchmen's a good film to watch, haha. But it's not really a favourite superhero film for me. And then I was going through my boxes, and as you know, I've been looking at Laserdiscs, and the two that popped out to me were Jaws. This is an interesting one. Not because of what was in it, and not because there's there's anything too special in it, although this one does have the soundtrack and it does have the book in it, plus the film in CAV format. But what was interesting about it was that the receipt was in it. So that was interesting. So I bought it from Laser Enterprises. I don't know if you can see the label, Laser Enterprises. I bought it on the 25th of March 1996. I travelled all the way to Wickford, Essex to buy it, because I remember most of the things I didn't get delivered if they were expensive. I bought this, Jaws, and it's limited to 10,000 copies for £109.99. And I bought it along with two other films, which one of them I don't know why I bought, Wayne's World 2, but I bought that second hand for £14.46. And then I bought the special widescreen edition of Mrs. Doubtfire, and that was £80. Now I do remember that because that had no end of bloopers. The film had just come out. This came out at the same time as it was out at the cinema, and the bloopers that were cut out of it. That man Robin Williams, my God, there were so many in it that I just watched the bloopers over and over and over again, because you can understand why they cut them out when you when you watched it. So Jaws is an interesting one because Jaws is one of my favourite films, but it was interesting because I found the receipt. And then I've got one special Laserdisc here to talk about for two reasons. One, it's for Down the Rabbit Hole, because he did a marvellous skit about Seven, which I encourage everybody to go and see. And the fact that this is something called the Criterion Collection. Now, the Criterion Collection is something that's still around now. They tend to produce films and release films that they feel should be archived and be around forever. They think they're heavily on preservation of film. Now, this was a very expensive box set, came with linear notes, but there's some linear notes on here that are, which is one of the reasons why I used to buy Laserdiscs, and I'll just read it out. It says, a note to the viewer. In its original theatrical release, prints of Seven were created using a silver retention process called CCE, whereby the silver leached out during conventional film processing is rebounded to the print. Silver retention drastically increases luminosity in the light portions of the image and the density of the dark tones. The process is so difficult, time-consuming and expensive that directors and studios rarely consider using it. David Fincher, the director, worked with the Criterion Collection for weeks to recreate the ideal effect. Only a few hundred of the 2,500 prints of Seven released theatrically were ever produced by silver retention, which means that this Laserdisc is a truer representation of the intended look of the film than many audiences saw in theatres. So this is where I started to learn a little bit about cinematography and what was worth collecting and what wasn't worth collecting. And I thought that Rabbit would get a good laugh out of that one, because he's done a little bit of a stint parody of Seven. And I'm just wondering whether he might have silverbacked his film. That's something he can discuss with me later on. So then we get to soundtracks. Now, when I was doing a little chat with Mainmeister, I was actually watching Star Trek The Motion Picture, which had just been re-released. They took the director's version that was released in 2001 and redid a 4K transfer, not only for a future release on 4K disc, but they've just released a Paramount Plus channel over there, and Nobody ever thought that Star Trek the Motion Picture would ever get the treatment, because when the director's version came out, they did all the optical effects again, and they did them in standard definition, which means that if they were going to do a 4K transfer, they'd have to go and do all the special effects again. There's a big story about this, because they said that they never shot the optical effects again in a higher resolution, where actually they did, and the person that did them kept all of the meshes, the wireframe meshes and opticals, on a computer that was owned by him. So Paramount ordered the optical effects to be done, but they never owned the copyright to the new effects. So under a deal, they went back and all of the remodels were redone in 4K. It cost more money to do, but they now think they now have the definitive edition of Star Trek the Motion Picture. And it gets a bad rap, Star Trek the Motion Picture, because some people call it the motionless picture. I mentioned that in one of the waffles. I actually quite liked it. It takes me back to those days where models were a thing. It wasn't all computer generated. So it's a fantastic spectacle to watch. It's just it didn't have the feel of the TV series. That's the point of the film, and that's where we come to what I've been listening to this week, which is Star Trek 2, Search for Spock, and Star Trek 3, The Wrath of Khan, both done by James Horner. Now, when these came out, I was a bit disappointed, because it was like, oh, no Jerry Goldsmith score. And that's because I was listening a lot more then to soundtracks than I do now. But when I listened to them, I wasn't. I was overjoyed, because they really did sound good. There were some really catchy moments and themes that have been used even now. And some of the segments in it lasted minutes. I mean, we're talking one track was about 16-17 minutes in length, like Stealing the Enterprise. These have now been expanded into larger scores. They're now 2 CDs, and I have them. But I'll never forget buying the gatefolded records and then buying the CD of it and listening to the difference between the quality of the two. And then the expanded scores just completed a journey that I went on in the first time watching these films. So, do I like them? Yes. I still hold the first motion picture film score to be the definitive Star Trek experience when it comes to music. But these two are pretty high up on my list. And earlier on in the blog, I talked a little bit about a TV show that I'd like to see made into a film, and that was The Outer Limits. So not only was I buying film scores, but TV scores and themes are high up there for me as well. This is the music on this was done by Dominic Fontier. There's not much I can say really about The Outer Limits that I wouldn't want you to go away, Google and look up if you're interested. But it has a very, very interesting beginning to The Outer Limits. It was supposed to draw you in each week by telling you that your TV set was being taken over by a higher power, and that they wanted to show you an experience that you had to watch, because there was no other TV for you to watch now. Your TV is now under the control of the higher power. And then you watched it, and then the TV was returned back to you, which was an interesting gimmick, but one that captivated me. Okay, it's black and white, and I'd have been watching these still at quite a young age, because it really was the monster movie, monster TV show of the week. But as a lad, I've got fond memories of it. They remade it into an 8-season colorized program, which equally you should go out and watch. But it's nowhere as fond memories of it as the original 2-season Outer Limits from the 50s and 60s. And then I've never stopped trying to introduce you to other composers that you might not have heard of, even though that they're well known to people like soundtrack collectors. So we talked about Roy Budd, Georges Delerue. There's one called Ron Goodwin. So there's Ron Goodwin. He did some Miss Marple films and a load of British films. Now, the problem with Ron Goodwin was that he was contracted to Ealing and a number of British film scores, film studios. He would score the film, but the film houses, like Ealing, destroyed all the recordings and only kept the sheet music, which means that if you want to hear these scores now, you either have to listen to it in the film itself, or you have to commission the sheet music to be brought out to an orchestra, re-recorded, produced onto the format of the time, MP3, CD, and then sold. And that's not going to happen. It's too costly a process. So during the 80s, Liberty X Records decided to commission a few. I think Get Carter was one. The Miss Marple that's here was definitely another. They're totally brilliant to listen to. There won't be your time. I mean, Miss Marple, I mean, everybody listens to Miss Marple. You think to yourself, oh my God, that biddy old lady, what do I want to listen to that for? But actually, the theme to Miss Marple is absolutely, on a harpsichord, is absolutely fantastic. And I will drop a link at the bottom. And we're nearing the end. The only other thing that that might be of interest, was that I was very surprised when I was speaking to a friend about his game collection. We started talking about the 3DS, and I asked him how many ROMs he'd got for, games he'd got for it. And like me, he didn't have that many. And we questioned each other why that was. And I said, well, I knew mine is because I just didn't have the money. It was a very expensive medium. The 3D effect, although nice, I usually turn the slider down so that it was in 2D, and then it turned itself into a Nintendo DS. But I said it was definitely one that I didn't want to mod because I wanted to buy the games later on and put them in. And the 3DS is still in a lovely condition here, although I don't have the large version of the 3DS. It's one of those ones where I keep thinking I'll go back one day and get myself a larger version. I looked at Kex this week, and they are coming down in price. But the only way that I could really keep up with games was buying these types of cartridges. This one's called a Sky 3DS cartridge, which has got a couple of rocker switches and an SD card slot. And there's nothing new to these in Japan. They're readily available. But what they allow you to do is to put games onto an SD card and make them work, and it gets past the proprietary system. Sorry, my camera's gone out of focus. I'm hoping to get it back. There we go. And so this was really the only way that I could keep up with the games. I do recommend that this is one method for you to do this. You can now mod your 3DS. You don't need to go down this route. But sometimes it's nice to keep a console as it was. There aren't that many consoles I've got now that aren't modded, and they tend to be the newer ones. So my DS is not modded because it uses another cartridge, but my Vita is modded, my PSP is modded, my Xbox 360 is modded, my Xbox was modded, my PS1 was modded, my Dreamcast was modded. So apart from a PS5, a PS4 and a PS3, plus this 3DS, I don't have too many unmodded machines. I'd like to hear what you feel about modding. But these little cartridges, they're a godsend if you don't have an awful lot of money. And I've always spent an awful lot of money to the games industry. I buy an awful lot. And you'll see that over the coming months when I show you some of the big box collections I've got. So that about wraps it up. I hope some of this was interesting. Don't think it was quite as interesting as some of the other weeks. But some exciting news. There is another blog of mine coming out in the next couple of hours. I'm not going to say too much about it. It's scheduled for 2:30 today. And it's just a little bit of an extra for people to look at to see whether they're interested in another little aspect of collecting, which I do. So until next week, thanks very much. And please keep those comments going. Bye-bye.